Welcome and thank you all for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock and I'm a Senior Knowledgeist at the AWRI. In this session, we'll be looking at ways in which you can determine a wine's authenticity or provenance via analytical techniques. Before we jump in and make a start, just a couple of quick reminders to anyone who is new to the AWRI webinar program. If you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question, please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click send to send it through. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, but feel free to send through any of your questions throughout any stage of the presentation. A reminder also that this session is being recorded and a link will be sent through to you later to view via the AWRI's YouTube channel. Now, for anyone who's just joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is wine provenance and isotopic approach. So today we're very lucky to have Dr. Eric Wilkes from the AWRI to present on this topic. Dr. Wilkes has worked in the wine industry for almost 25 years in both the commercial production and also research areas. For the last 10 years, Eric has worked at the AWRI leading the organisation's commercial arm and conducting a range of research projects, including using advanced chemistry to determine a wine's authenticity and provenance. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry for the technical difference. No matter how many times you practice that, it will always go slightly wrong. So thank you everyone for joining us for this presentation, this webinar. I just want to start off by pointing out that a lot of this work has been done by one of my colleagues, Dr. Martin Day, who was very important and really was the driver for doing a great deal of this work at the AWRI. And so I want to thank him in advance for the amazing work he's done on this project. So wine fraud, it's an interesting and much talked about problem, but I think the first thing we should recognize is it's not a new problem. And there's a great quote from Pliny the Elder, who is a Roman from classical times. And it goes, the local bar establishments seem to have an unlimited supply of prestigious Falernian for unusually low prices. And I think you could take that quote to just about any time in history and someone would be saying the same thing. So wine fraud is definitely not a new problem. It's something that's been around for a long, long time. And the way we approach it's probably hasn't changed in some ways too much, but technology is driving us into different spaces. The other thing that we have to acknowledge is that food fraud in general is a massive issue. It's very hard to get figures on how much wine is actually fraudulently made or presented, but the estimates on the overall food fraud are, in the range of $50 billion. And there are figures quoted saying in some areas 5% of wine being sold in the marketplace may be fraudulent. So it is a big problem. It's an issue that we need to address. But what are we talking about when we talk about wine fraud? It's not just a simple, class that's easily defined. Firstly, we have fake wine products, and that's really when is it actually wine? There have been cases of basically people bottling water with some wood spirit or methanol added, a bit of coloring, and leading to people dying. Essentially fake products that aren't really wine with all sorts of dodgy additives through there. Now, when we're trying to understand if a wine is a fake product, luckily that's pretty easy to address through standard wine analysis and just seeing, does it look like a wine? And we can even fingerprint that very quickly using things like FTIR and Raman analysis. The other way of combating this tends to be using things like trusted supplier status, where certain regulatory authorities in different markets sort of identify wine from certain places as being trusted and meeting the food standards of that country, and hence being allowed to be brought in without too many issues. The other tools often used in this are traceability tools, which are essentially documentation to show that it is a wine that's come from a vineyard through a winery and hasn't had anything happen in between. The next one, and that's what we'll be talking about mostly today, but we'll touch on the others as well, is misrepresentation. Is this the wine they say it is? So is it actually a Barossa Shiraz? Anything along those lines. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have, because chemically it's a lot harder to do. Now, there are lots of wine compositional analysis tools that we can use to do this, things like nuclear magnetic resonance, fluorescence spectroscopy. There's been some great work done at Adelaide University recently in that space. There's quite a few companies offering trace metals analysis to identify the origin of a wine. We've been looking, as a lot of other researchers, at isotopic analysis, and some places are even using trace DNA analysis to identify varietals in wine as well. So there's a lot of work in those spaces, but it's also quite difficult to do because you're looking at quite detailed or minor differences between wines. The other tool that's used in misrepresentation, and this is what we see in the market all the time, are tools that are essentially market-facing, consumer-facing, grape-to-consumer traceability. So in other words, having smart labels and data-rich labels that someone can use on their phone, take a picture of it, and that links to, does this wine come from where it is? Is it actually the original label? Those sort of things from there. And those sort of tools are becoming really, really powerful, and they're often linked to what we call distributed ledger systems. Now, an example of distributed ledger systems are blockchain, but that's not the only one there. But the core of those is having something that is stored in a way that can't be changed without permission of the original owners, or that you can see has been changed, that people can track back and understand what they're doing. So when we look at these systems for misrepresentation, we have to recognize that we need to have both the ability to use wine compositional analysis and this consumer-facing tools, because to put it bluntly, a lot of the equipment that we use to do the advanced wine compositional analysis definitely will never be a handheld carry around with you sort of thing. For instance, the isotopic ratio work we've done, while it's incredibly powerful, it involves 2 different laboratories with 3 different pieces of equipment, all of it adding up to probably close to $1 million worth of tech and process. That's good for policing it when we think we've got a problem, try to identify it, but we also need to have those tools in the marketplace. Now, when the next 2 that people think of when we talk about wine fraud is counterfeiting and refill. And to put it bluntly, they're actually the easier ones to address in many ways. In the marketplace, once again, we can use things like smart labels, supply chain analysis. This is where people in the companies look to see where things are turning up in their market and, well, did we distribute them there? What's happening? And when you're talking about refill, there's some great technology already in the market and some really cool things being developed at the moment, where the actual act of opening the capsule or the screw cap will break the system and mean that you have kind of RFD or some process like that, which will no longer work for the system. So there's some really good tools being used very successfully to beat counterfeiting and refill. And when it's in the lab, it's actually very easy for us to identify when there's a counterfeit wine there, as long as we have a reference sample, which most wineries would have. So I said just very blatantly that counterfeiting and refill is easy to identify. And honestly, if we have a reference bottle, direct forgeries are very easy to identify in the lab. They don't need $1 million worth of equipment, and it doesn't take very long to do. We usually use tools like looking at organic acids, trace metals, or mid-infrared spectra. And we can use this to put together often 400 or 500 data points within literally 2 hours and say with more than 99.99% confidence, is this wine the same as the reference bottle that we've been given? And we do this quite regularly for people, both in commercial space and in the production space, to try and understand, has this wine been faked? Is it adulterated? Is it what it says it is? So that's not an area that we think is lacking. There's not much research needed there. This is sort of a standard process that we can do quite simply, as long as someone has a reference bottle to compare it to. But the much more difficult thing is if we have a bottle of wine which isn't actually trying to counterfeit something, but is just claiming to be something else, can we identify its origin of an unknown wine? So someone just creates a label and decides to call it an Australian wine. Can we demonstrate that is or isn't the case? And this is not just an academic problem or even a marketing problem. The stay awake at night issue that we think of is if someone makes a fake or a wine that has been adulterated to make it work better and makes people sick but calls it an Australian wine, what would that do to our market? So it's really, really important that we try and have tools available so that we can take those products and identify, did they come from Australia and where did they come from if they didn't? And there's been multiple cases of this happening with things like milk. I think everyone remembers the melamine issue with milk, but there's also been cases of fake wines in a number of markets which have been adulterated with methanol or wood spirit, leading to people dying from their consumption. So really, really important to be able to do this. So can we just use any form of chemical testing? Unfortunately, it is quite a big challenge. Firstly, we have to take into account that wine changes with time. So, you can't always just use the normal organic chemistry that we would to characterize a wine, such as the organic acids, color compounds, all the flavor compounds, because, we take great pride in saying that wine does mature with time and hence it will change with time. So we need to take that into account. The other thing to keep in mind that all wines are differentiated by just 2% of what they are. The other 98% is just ethanol and water or alcohol and water. So we don't have this massive sort of differences across wines. All the wines in the world are differentiated by just that 2%. So if we only look at one component, like be it one of the organic compounds or one of the metals, then there's a good chance that they will be the same from two different regions. So it's something to be considered there. But the things that are going for us is, especially when we're talking about metals and what's in wine, literally every naturally occurring metal in the periodic table appears in wine, usually in very, very small amounts, but they're all there. So the AWRI Authenticity Project, we decided about 4 years ago to investigate the use of stable isotopic ratios of strontium, boron, lithium, lead, and oxygen, as well as trace metals, to see if we can use a range of things combined to narrow down and identify where wines came from. So not just looking at one analyte, but looking at a range of different things and trying to combine them. Now in the project, I won't dig into this, and the final report on this project will be available from Wine Australia in the not distant future, but you can read the details there, which are very in-depth chemistry. We're going to avoid all the in-depth chemistry if we can today and just talk about the results. But to give you an idea of the structure of the project, we got 292 Australian wines, 94 wines from overseas, mostly focused on Cabernet and Chardonnay because they're two of the biggest varieties, but we did have a reasonable amount of Pinot, Shiraz and Riesling and Merlot for regions where Chardonnay and Cabernet were just not very common. Now, one of the obvious questions is, why did we focus on isotopic ratios or isotope ratios? And it's relatively simple because isotopes are just different versions of the same element which have different numbers of neutrons in their nucleus. Now, that's all very good for a chemist to say, and some of you will probably remember that from your high school chemistry. But the important thing to take out of that is isotopes of the same element behave the same chemically, so they don't react differently. And that's a generalization, but it means that what we do to the wine, or as it matures, the relative numbers of these isotopes should stay the same. So even though we do lots of things to the wine and the wine will change, the actual ratios of the amounts of different isotopes shouldn't change drastically during the wine's life. So that's really good, means it doesn't change. But where it becomes really powerful, and we see this all the time in archaeology and all that, where they try to identify where someone comes, they find a mummified body or something, and then they use isotopic analysis to try to work out where they came from. Well, it's the same for wine. The original sources of these isotopes vary depending on their source. So while they may not change over the production process, they will change depending where they came from, which is perfect for what we want to do. And in this study, the different elements used came from a range of different sources. Some of them come from the air, some of them come from the water, some of them come from the soil and geology. And this is really useful because A, it means that no one thing is driving it necessarily, but it also links to that really, really mystical thing we like to talk about in wine called terroir. In other words, we're pulling in all the aspects of what makes each wine unique. We're not just relying on one part of the chemistry or one idea within there. So why do we use multiple different isotope ratios? Couldn't we just use one? And quite often, lots of research studies have used just one and rely on that to give an idea of where a wine is from, or to show that a wine is unique. And I think the easiest way is just compare it to how we identify a person, such as myself. If you just use the first name, you really only narrow things down to, millions of individuals. But if we add a second name, you get it down to hundreds, which is still not getting it down too much. And I think, let's be real, everyone's Googled their own name at some point, and so they've seen that there's lots and lots of them. It's depressing how many Eric Wilkses are out there, but it's true. And if you've got a name like, John Smith, then there's millions still. But when we get to a third item, like a birth date, then we actually get it down to very, very few individuals. And that's what we're doing when we use multiple isotopic ratios. Because they all come from different sources, by using lots of different things, even though it's harder and we have to use more equipment, we make it much more robust, and the chances of them being the same for any single or two regions becomes much, much, much lower. But I do have to point out something here. I've deliberately left 2 green dots in my little graphic there because you can never be 100% certain that 2 different regions won't make a wine which have the same isotopic ratios. The wines can be different, but anything you choose only has a degree of certainty. So what we're trying to do is reduce that uncertainty as much as we possibly can. So in the AWRI study, we focused on the isotopic ratios of strontium, boron, lithium, and oxygen. We did have a look at just trace metal content, which is something we do all the time here, and lead isotopic ratios, but these were discarded mostly because they didn't differentiate very well. They didn't add to the process. And they also were tended to be more impacted by the winemaking processes. And I'll mention a bit more about that right at the end of the talk. So how did we do? I'm not going to get into details about the statistics and the methodologies, etc., that we used in this because it's very detailed and that's an hour-long webinar all by itself. But essentially using advanced statistics, OPLSDA, and those 4 isotopic ratios we talked about, we could differentiate Australian wines quite well. So when it came to identifying successfully Australian wines, we were got 97.3% of the Australian wines correctly identified. And when it came to foreign wines, which we only had a much smaller data set, so we could have improved that probably by having more wines, we still identified 77.7% of those as not being Australian. So overall, a 92.5% identification rate, which is really good. You know, when you combine it with other technology, that we can say with quite good confidence that if we were given an unknown wine using this technology and the data we've developed from here, that we could identify isn't an Australian wine. That's a really good outcome and really important. Now, this is not a tool, as I said earlier, that will be able to be used generally in the marketplace. This is the sort of tool that once someone has a suspicion or has a concern about a wine, we can bring it to the laboratory and work with our partners in CSIRO and our systems here to actually identify, is this an Australian wine or not? But it is really successful. It worked really, really well. But we're from Australia. Can we do Australian regionality here? And essentially what we found is we can do it reasonably well. So when we just look at what state the wine came from, what we found, and I've just sort of separated these graphs out here so you can see them, is that while wines from the different states do gather together, there is a fair bit of overlap. And that's probably not surprising when you consider that some regions will overlap into different states. And we're talking about a very broad brush here. But our success rate was about 70% overall for those regional identification. And this is this confusion matrix, which is what you can see down there. You can see how well we went for each of the states through that. So just doing it on states alone didn't work as well as we'd like. There may be tools where we can narrow it down a bit more, but yeah, it seemed we get a reasonable separation from state to state. So what we decided to do was have a look at the geology, and rather than trying to nail it down by zone or state, we actually said, well, can we identify it based on the underlying geology? And so this uses something called the ACE classification, which is Australian crustal elements. And when we did that, we actually found that we did get good and improved processes from there, but it's still a pretty broad brush tool and probably needs a fair bit more work to refine it, because not only do you have the underlying crustal issues, but you have to also combine the issues that come from the soil and how those soils relate to the crustal material below, and what other confounding factors are getting into the process through there. I should point out that all the wines from the Australian survey were pulled together by Wine Australia, and so we have a lot of confidence that those wines do represent where they came from. Although, as always with Australian wines, there could be a bit of confusion added by blending for small amounts. So what I think we can say is, yes, we can say whether a wine is Australian, and we've got a pretty good indication of where in Australia it came from. Pretty happy with that. But then we have to also check, are there any other issues that we need to take into account? An important one is, does the data vary from vintage to vintage? And other than a couple of slight outliers that we saw in the Hunter Valley, which probably do relate to rain events for oxygen 18, what we saw was that, no, we don't have to worry about vintage to vintage, because the differences that we saw from year to year are much smaller than the differences we saw between regions or between Australia and overseas. So yes, we saw small changes as we go from year to year, but those changes are still much smaller than what's driving us being able to see the differences between Australia and the rest of the world. Another thing that was raised, especially since we used boron data quite strongly, is, well, what about leaching metals from within the glass? So we took a number of wines and we stored them for 6 months in bottles from around the world with different glass types and different amounts of recycled material in there. So as you can see, these are actually pictures of the bottles we actually used. We used flint, green, brown, the whole range. And what we saw was that, once again, the variability in the boron due to the glass was stored in was much, much smaller than the variability based on where the wine came from. So we're not worried about that impact of glass at all. We also did a look at the impact of variety, and I haven't included this data here to try to keep the seminar to time, but once again, variety didn't make a major impact on it, just like vintage didn't. Now, one of the things that we left out was lead isotopes. So we originally looked at those, we spent a fair bit of time studying them, and it's a really good example of why you need to have a knowledge of wine and not just leave this sort of work to generalized thoughts for all foods and around the world. And this is a graph of the same sort of work I showed earlier for separating wine based on all the isotopes, but just highlighting the red and white when we included lead. And I think you can see, without doing anything too strange there, that what we showed we could separate really, really well was whether the red wine was red or white. Now, I don't know about you, but spending thousands and thousands of dollars to decide whether a wine is red wine or white wine is probably not the target of this sort of work. And it did highlight that, when you've got lead isotopes, something weird was going on due to winemaking practices. And of course, after a very short amount of thought, we realized that we should have a look at the impact of bentonite. And what we realized is, when we use things like lead isotopes, what we became really, really good at identifying was where the bentonite used in the wine, this is for white wines, obviously, came from. So from white wines, we could actually make a pretty good stab at saying where the bentonite that used to heat stabilize the wine came from, if it was a US Australian bentonite, a European bentonite, etc. This obviously takes away from using lead isotopes for identification of where the wine came from, but it's really good and important experiment to show that why you have to be careful, because many of the things we do in winemaking can impact what we see in these sort of studies. So in summary, yes, using advanced statistics and isotopic ratios of strontium, oxygen, boron, lithium, we can say with quite good certainty whether a wine is an Australian wine or not. And I think this is an important outcome and a really important tool available to the industry. We also had some success in achieving an understanding of where in Australia wine came from using the same sort of tools. We found that strontium became one of the really really important parts for regional classification, which makes sense because it comes from a combination of water and the crustal elements below the vines. So with a bit more work, I think that area could continue to be clarified. Vintage and variety didn't have an impact on using this sort of technology, and a study of the bottles showed that they don't impact using this technology. Finally, trace metals alone didn't give us a clear differentiation of wine origin. A number of companies, however, have had some success in using those sort of tools, but overall we found that they were impacted really strongly by the winemaking process because a lot of trace metals are introduced by things like bentonite and filtration. And lead isotopes simply are not useful for white wine because of contribution from bentonite. So with that, very quick summary of a huge amount of work. And as I said, it will be available eventually from Wine Australia through our final report on the project. But I'd need to thank the CSIRO staff who contributed to this really hugely, specifically Claire Wright, Chris Warwick, sorry, Chris, and Dr. Jason Kirby, as well as a range of industry collaborators listed there, and of course Wine Australia, who supplied most of the Australian wines and also provided the funding through this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for that. Just like to remind everyone, if they have a question, just to pop the question through on the Q&A on the Zoom toolbar. There's a Q&A feature there to type through a question. Eric, there's a couple of questions that have come through. I might read them out at the same time. You might be able to answer them at the same time. The first one is, whose job is it to police wine fraud? And the second one was, are there checks on wines that are imported into Australia?
Yeah, great questions. To put it bluntly, in the vast majority of economies, the job of policing wine fraud is up to the people selling the wine. It's not seen as, it's a commercial issue, and that's the way it tends to be treated. The difference is when people are concerned about not necessarily misrepresentation of wines, but fake wines. So, you know, in a number of markets, we have to do things like test for methanol, and that's because they're concerned or had experience with that. So if it's a question of showing whether the wine is safe to consume, etc., that is often done through the regulatory controls of the various food safety and food regulatory processes. If it's a question of things like misrepresentation, is it the wine through there? While most economies will help, and the police forces basically will follow up and prosecute people when it has been identified, it's usually up to the sellers and the on-sellers, producers and that, to actually identify the wines in the first place and highlight the problem. Wines coming into Australia, unless they're identified by the consumers, no, are not checked. There's no program where we check wines regularly to understand whether they are really what they are. But that's true of pretty well all foods and materials coming into Australia.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that's come through. Have you tried different statistical methods for classification to see if there are any differences on the results?
Yes, vast numbers of different statistics. The OPLS DA methodology is probably one of the more advanced ones through there. And you have to always, I suppose one of the things that needs to be considered here is we can always get a perfect differentiation if we chuck enough statistics at it, but it doesn't mean that when we take an unknown that it will be successful in removing that from there. So yes, we have done a lot of different kinds of statistics. Well, and I say that with a royal we. Dr. Martin Day did an amazing amount of statistics, and applied a lot of new technologies and ideas for that. And we are constantly looking at what other things we can do, and we would use the different data sets there. But we found the most robust way of doing it was the approach we took with OPL-SDA.
Okay, that looks like all that's come through at this stage, Eric. So if there's no more questions, we might wind this webinar up. But before we do that, So I'd just like to thank Eric again for providing the important insights into wine provenance. I'm sure everyone who attended today got a lot out of this session. Also like to thank you, the audience, for joining in and taking part. And I'd like to remind you that, as always, you will receive a link later today to view the recording of this presentation, which will be available on the AWRI's YouTube channel. Also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing the funding and support for the webinars via the AWRI Extension Project. The next webinar is on Thursday, the 22nd of July, and we have Sandy Hathaway from Wine Australia presenting on the 2021 National Vintage Report. So if you'd like to register for this session, please visit the AWRI website. And thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar. Thanks again.